He was 52 when the first crack showed up, not in the walls of his house, not in the furnace that would later start making that sound, but in the quiet belief that his life had finally settled into something safe. His name was Kevin Archer. He lived in a quiet neighborhood outside Phoenix, the kind of place where nothing unusual ever happened unless someone made it happen. He had built that life from nothing, walked away from a family that treated him like a mistake, spent 5 years on his own until they stopped asking about him altogether, until it was easier for everyone to pretend he didn't exist. And somehow, he thought he had outgrown all of that. He thought wrong. His wife was out of town when the furnace stopped working. It wasn't dramatic at first, just a strange mechanical rhythm coming from below, something uneven, something that didn't belong. He called a repair technician, gave the address, and went back upstairs like it was any other inconvenience, like it was just another thing to check off and forget. 20 minutes later, his phone buzzed. It was the technician. "Sir, there's a locked room down here. I think you need to come see this." Kevin didn't believe him at first. There had never been a locked room in that house, not in all the time he had lived there. But there was something in the message, something off, something that didn't read like a joke or a mistake. By the time he reached the bottom of those basement stairs, something had already shifted, quietly, completely. That was the moment his marriage ended. He just didn't understand it yet. Get comfortable and remember, the people in these stories always had a choice. They just chose wrong. Drop a comment, hit that like button, and make sure you're subscribed. Trust me, you're going to want to stay for this one. That message changed the pace of everything. Kevin didn't run at first. He moved fast but controlled, the way someone does when they're not sure if panic is justified yet. The stairs to the basement felt longer than usual, each step carrying a quiet weight he couldn't explain, and by the time he reached the bottom, the air itself felt wrong, colder than it should have been in a place like that. Leon Curtis stood near the back wall, slightly off to the side, as if he didn't want to be directly in front of whatever he had found. He turned when Kevin approached, his expression tight, not scared exactly, but alert in a way that made Kevin immediately take the situation more seriously. "There," Leon said, pointing past a set of old storage shelves. Kevin frowned. Those shelves had been there since they moved in, heavy, metal, rarely touched. But now they were pulled just enough to expose something behind them. Something that had never been visible before. A door, plain painted to match the wall. The kind of thing you would never notice unless someone showed you exactly where to look. Kevin stepped closer, confusion replacing hesitation. "That wasn't there," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. Leon didn't answer right away. Instead, he gestured toward the handle, 4 separate padlocks, all secured on the outside. Kevin stared at them, his mind catching up in fragments instead of full thoughts. Locks on the outside didn't protect anything inside from getting in. They kept whatever was behind that door from getting out. The realization landed slowly but heavily, settling somewhere deep in his chest. "Did you hear anything?" Kevin asked. Leon nodded once. "Before I texted you, something steady, like breathing. I didn't touch anything." Kevin moved closer, close enough to feel the cold coming off the door, but the sound Leon described was gone now. The silence felt deliberate, like whatever had been there knew it had already done its job. Kevin pulled his phone out. "We're calling this in." Leon didn't argue. The police arrived faster than Kevin expected. 2 officers at first, then another shortly after. Questions came immediately, short and direct. Kevin answered them as clearly as he could, but even as he spoke, he could feel something shifting beneath the surface, something that had nothing to do with the door itself. One of the officers examined the locks while the other took notes. A bolt cutter was brought in from the patrol car, and within minutes, metal snapped one piece at a time. The sound echoed in the basement, sharp and final. When the last lock dropped to the floor, there was a brief pause, like everyone present understood that whatever came next would matter. The door opened inward. Kevin leaned slightly to see past the officer standing in front, expecting something. Anything that would explain why that door existed in the first place. The room was empty, not abandoned, not neglected in a way that felt intentional. The concrete floor was clean, too clean for a space that had supposedly been hidden behind shelves for years. A single light bulb hung overhead, switched off, and in the far corner sat a small Bluetooth speaker, its indicator light faintly blinking. Next to it, a cheap prepaid phone rested on a cardboard box, screen cracked but still powered. One of the officers stepped inside carefully, scanning the space before picking up the phone with gloved hands. "This was used recently," he said, turning it slightly. "Still active." Kevin's gaze shifted to the speaker. "Turn it on," he said. The officer pressed a button. A low, rhythmic sound filled the room, breathing. Kevin felt it immediately. Not fear, not yet, but recognition. This wasn't random. This wasn't something left behind by accident. This had been placed, timed, and triggered with purpose. Leon exhaled slowly behind him. "That's what I heard." Kevin didn't respond, because now the question wasn't what had been in that room. It was who needed him to believe something had been. 2 days later, the situation took a direction Kevin couldn't control. The call didn't come with urgency, which made it worse. It was calm, procedural, the kind of tone that suggested decisions had already been made before he was even part of the conversation. He was asked to come down to the station, not as a witness, not as someone helping, but as someone whose name had started appearing in places it shouldn't have been. Kevin sat across from Detective Grant Holloway for the first time in a small interview room that felt deliberately neutral, plain walls, metal table, nothing distracting. Grant didn't rush. He watched Kevin the way experienced investigators do, not looking for what was said, but for how it was said. "Have you ever rented a storage unit on the east side of the city?" Grant asked. Kevin shook his head without hesitation. "No." Grant slid a folder across the table. Inside were copies, contracts, payment logs, identification records. Kevin's name was printed clearly on every page. His signature sat at the bottom of the agreement, clean, familiar, unmistakably his. He stared at it longer than he should have. "That's not possible," Kevin said, but the words didn't carry the weight they should have. They sounded thin even to him. Grant didn't argue. He simply opened the folder to another page, then another, laying out a timeline in pieces, payments made in cash. Entry logs tied to a keypad code assigned to Kevin's account, access recorded multiple times over several weeks. "You're saying none of this is yours?" Grant asked. Kevin leaned back slightly, trying to force his thoughts into order. "I've never been there. I've never signed that." Grant studied him for a moment, then closed the folder and stood. "Then you should come see it." The storage facility sat on the edge of a commercial strip, the kind of place people passed every day without noticing. Rows of identical metal doors stretched across the property, each one hiding something someone didn't want in their home. Unit 214. Grant entered the code and pulled the door up halfway before stepping aside. Kevin moved forward slowly, not because he was afraid, but because something inside him had already started to fracture, and he didn't know what he would see when the door opened completely. Inside, the space was organized. Boxes stacked neatly along one wall, a small folding chair, a plastic storage bin left slightly open. It didn't look abandoned, it looked maintained. Grant nodded toward the bin. Kevin stepped closer and lifted the lid. Clothing, woman's clothing, folded, sorted, intentional. Kevin exhaled once, slow and controlled, but his hands didn't move. He didn't touch anything else. "There's more," Grant said. From one of the boxes, he pulled out a prepaid debit card and placed it on top of the bin. "This account is registered under your name." Kevin didn't respond. Then came the photograph. Grant held it up without commentary. A woman Kevin had never seen before looked back at him, smiling, unaware of whatever had brought her image into that room. The photo wasn't old. It hadn't been forgotten. It had been placed there. "Her name is Carla Benton," Grant said. "She's been reported missing." Kevin felt something tighten in his chest, not panic, not confusion, but recognition of a pattern forming around him. Piece by piece, detail by detail, each one pointing in the same direction toward him. "I don't know her," Kevin said, and this time his voice held. Grant lowered the photo slightly, but didn't put it away. "Your name is on the unit, your access code opened that door. Your financial trail connects to this card." Kevin looked at the space again, forcing himself to take it in differently now, not as a stranger walking into someone else's storage, but as someone being told this was his. Everything about it felt deliberate, measured, constructed. Grant closed the bin and stepped back. "Right now, you're not under arrest," he said, "but you are involved, whether you realize it or not." Kevin nodded once, not because he agreed, but because he understood something far more important. This wasn't evidence that had been found. This was evidence that had been built. Brooke Archer returned that evening as if nothing had shifted. She stepped through the front door with the same energy she always carried after a short trip, composed, attentive, already reading the room before Kevin had said a word. Her eyes moved across his face first, searching, measuring, then softened in a way that would have looked convincing to anyone who hadn't already started noticing the details that didn't belong. "What happened?" she asked, setting her bag down without breaking eye contact. Kevin didn't answer immediately. He watched her instead, not openly, not in a way that would raise suspicion, but carefully, the way someone watches a reflection to see if it lags behind reality. "Something came up while you were gone," he said. Concern settled into her expression with precision, not too fast, not too slow. She stepped closer, one hand lightly touching his arm, grounding the moment, anchoring it in something familiar. "Are you okay?" The question was right, the tone was right. Everything about it fit. Kevin nodded once. "I need to show you something." He led her toward the basement, keeping his pace steady, not rushing, not hesitating. She followed without resistance, her posture relaxed, her breathing even, as if she were walking into something she hadn't already rehearsed in her mind. When they reached the bottom, Kevin stopped just short of the wall where the hidden door had been exposed. He didn't point immediately, he let her see it on her own. Her eyes found it within seconds. There it was again, that fraction of a pause, so brief it could have been missed entirely. A stillness that didn't belong to surprise, but to recognition, then it was gone. "What is that?" Brooke asked, her voice tightening just enough to suggest fear. Kevin didn't respond to the question. "It was behind the shelves," he said instead. She stepped closer, studying the door, her hand hovering near it, but never quite touching. "How long has that been there?" "That's what I'm trying to figure out." She turned back to him, her expression shifting into something more unsettled, more personal. "Did someone break in?" Kevin shook his head slightly. "No signs of that." Her gaze moved again, this time slower, scanning the space with intent. "Then how does something like this just exist in your house without you knowing?" The phrasing caught his attention. "Your house, not ours." It was subtle. It would have passed unnoticed on any other day. But Kevin held on to it, storing it away without reacting. "They found things inside," he said. Brooke's eyes returned to his immediately. "What kind of things?" "Devices. Something that made it sound like someone was in there." She inhaled sharply, her reaction immediate, almost too immediate. "That's not normal, Kevin, that's..." She stopped herself, recalibrating mid-sentence, then reached for his hand. "We need to talk to a lawyer." The suggestion came fast, faster than expected. Kevin studied her face again, not looking for fear this time, but for control, for intention hidden underneath performance. She held his gaze steadily, her grip firm, her presence steady, exactly what someone would expect from a spouse trying to protect their partner. "I already spoke to the police," Kevin said. She nodded quickly. "Good, that's good. Then we just stay ahead of this, right? We don't let it spiral." Stay ahead, the words settled differently than the rest. Kevin didn't respond right away. He let the silence sit for a moment, long enough to feel the weight of everything that hadn't been said. Brooke filled it naturally, stepping closer again, lowering her voice. "You didn't do anything wrong," she said. "Whatever this is, someone is trying to set you up." Kevin looked at her, really looked this time, not at the expression she chose to show, but at the precision behind it, the way every word aligned just slightly too well, like something practiced rather than felt. Most people wouldn't have caught it. Kevin did. And once he saw it, he couldn't unsee it, not the timing, not the phrasing, not the control. He nodded slowly, giving her exactly what she expected in that moment, agreement without resistance, trust without question. But something had already changed. Not in the house, not in the situation, in how he was looking at her. Travis Boone didn't react with surprise. He reacted with focus. Kevin met him at a quiet office space Travis used on the edge of the city, a place that felt more like a workspace than anything personal. Clean desk, 2 chairs, a laptop already open as if Travis had been expecting something complicated long before Kevin walked in. There was no small talk, no attempt to soften the situation. Travis simply gestured for Kevin to sit and asked for everything. Kevin handed over what he had access to, account statements, transaction histories, anything tied to his name that could be traced. Travis didn't rush through it. He moved line by line, detail by detail, not looking for something obvious, but for something consistent. "You said you didn't open anything connected to that unit," Travis said without looking up. "I didn't." Travis nodded slightly, still focused on the screen. "Then we're not looking for a mistake. We're looking for a pattern." Kevin leaned back, watching him work. There was something steady about the way Travis approached problems, not emotional, not reactive, just methodical. And for the first time since everything started, Kevin felt like he was standing next to someone who wasn't guessing, Minutes passed before Travis spoke again. "Here," he said, turning the laptop slightly. Kevin leaned forward. At first, it didn't look like anything. Small transactions, modest amounts. Transfers that didn't stand out on their own, but Travis zoomed out, widening the view, stretching the timeline across years instead of weeks. "That's where it changes," Travis said. Kevin's eyes moved across the screen again, slower this time, following the repetition instead of the individual numbers. The same type of transfer appearing at irregular intervals, never large enough to trigger attention, never consistent enough to feel automated. "How long has that been going on?" Kevin asked. Travis tapped the screen once. "Over 8 years. The number settled heavily. Kevin didn't interrupt. "These aren't accidents," Travis continued. "They're controlled. Someone's moving money in a way that avoids attention, keeps everything under reporting thresholds, spreads it out so nothing spikes." Kevin's jaw tightened slightly. "From my accounts, yes." The room felt smaller. Travis opened another tab, pulling up linked accounts, connections branching outward from Kevin's primary profile. "There's more," he said. "This account here, it's tied to the debit card found in that unit." Kevin stared at it, not speaking. "It's under your name," Travis added, then paused, finally looking up. "But you already knew that part." Kevin nodded once. Travis leaned back slightly, folding his arms. "So either someone has access to everything you have, or you've been involved longer than you realize." Kevin didn't respond to that. Instead, he asked a different question. "How would someone do that without me noticing?" Travis considered it for a moment, then spoke carefully. "Access doesn't always mean breaking in. Sometimes it's proximity, routine, or predictability." Kevin's mind moved quickly, connecting pieces that hadn't lined up before. "My phone," he said. Travis watched him. "It stays on the nightstand when I sleep," Kevin continued. "Unlocked half the time." Travis didn't interrupt. Kevin exhaled slowly, the realization settling in fully now. If someone had it, even for a short window, they could authorize things, confirm transactions, set up accounts. "Not just once," Travis said, repeatedly. Kevin nodded. The timeline made sense now in a way it hadn't before. Not random, not recent. Built gradually, layered over time, hidden inside normal activity until it became part of the background. "She didn't rush it," Kevin said quietly. Travis didn't ask who. "She didn't need to." Kevin added. The room went still for a moment. Not because there was nothing left to say, but because everything important had already been understood. Travis closed the laptop halfway. "This isn't something that started last week," he said. "Whoever did this has been working at it for years." Kevin looked down at the table, his thoughts no longer scattered, no longer trying to catch up. They had aligned, clear, fixed, cold. "This wasn't a setup," Kevin said. Travis raised an eyebrow slightly. Kevin met his gaze. "This was a build." So Kevin stopped asking questions and started paying attention. He didn't change anything on the surface. His routine stayed the same, his tone steady, his reactions controlled, but internally, something had shifted into a different kind of focus. One that didn't rely on trust anymore. It relied on observation, on timing, on letting things reveal themselves without interference. The opportunity came without warning. Denise Fowler arrived late in the afternoon, her visit casual on the surface, the kind of drop-in that didn't require explanation. Kevin greeted her briefly, kept his tone neutral, then stepped away under the pretense of handling a call, giving them space while staying close enough to hear without being seen. The conversation started normally, light topics, familiar rhythm. Nothing that stood out. Kevin almost dismissed it. Then Brooke's voice changed. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't obvious. It was a subtle shift in tone, a tightening, a precision that hadn't been there before, like something had been switched from casual to controlled without announcement. "He still doesn't see it," Brooke said quietly. Denise didn't respond immediately. "You're sure?" "I've watched him," Brooke replied. "He follows what's in front of him. He always has." Kevin stood still, every part of his attention locked in place. "And the situation?" Denise asked, contained. Brooke said. "Everything is where it needs to be. The records, the accounts, the timeline. It all connects back to him." Denise exhaled slowly. "And the woman?" A brief pause, then Brooke answered. "Carla Benton is exactly where she's supposed to be." Kevin felt something settle into place inside him. Not shock, not disbelief, but confirmation. "She agreed to stay out of sight," Brooke continued. "Long enough for everything to lock in. After that, it won't matter." Denise shifted slightly. "You're sure this holds?" Brooke let out a quiet breath. "It already does." The conversation moved on after that, back to safer ground, as if nothing significant had been said, but Kevin didn't need anything else. He stepped away silently, leaving the house without drawing attention. His movements calm, deliberate. He didn't confront her. He didn't react. Instead, he made a call. Warren Pike answered the second ring. Kevin kept the explanation brief, direct, focusing only on what mattered: a name, a location range, a situation that required verification without delay. Warren didn't ask unnecessary questions. "I'll find her," he said. The next few days passed without visible change. Kevin maintained the same pattern, the same presence, the same predictable version of himself that had allowed everything to unfold without resistance. Then Warren called back. "She's in Phoenix," he said. "Different name, but it's her chalked in under cash payments, not hiding well, just staying quiet." Kevin listened without interrupting. "I spoke to her," Warren continued. "She didn't realize how serious this was. She thought she was helping someone with a temporary arrangement." Kevin closed his eyes briefly, not out of emotion, but to steady the clarity forming in his thoughts. "Can you document it?" he asked. "Already done," Warren said. "Photos, statements, everything tied to her identity." Kevin nodded, even though Warren couldn't see it. "Good," he said. When the call ended, Kevin remained still for a moment, not because he needed time to process, but because everything had already aligned. There was no uncertainty left, no missing pieces. Only a complete structure built carefully, patiently, over years, and now fully visible. He didn't confront her. Kevin moved carefully, not because he was unsure, but because timing mattered more than anything else now. Everything he had gathered, every detail, every confirmation, it only held value if it was used at the right moment, in the right way, without giving her time to adjust. So he didn't argue. He didn't accuse. He let the routine continue. Then he sent it. No name attached, no explanation. Just a file containing two things: a recorded conversation and a recent image of Carla Benton standing outside a hotel in Phoenix, holding that day's newspaper. Proof that couldn't be dismissed, placed directly into a channel Brooke wouldn't expect. He watched the effect that night. She came into the bedroom later than usual, her movements slower, her focus pulled inward, as if something had shifted just out of reach. She stood near the doorway for a moment, phone still in her hand, her expression unreadable for the first time since everything began. Kevin didn't move. He didn't speak. By morning, he was already out the door. Detective Grant Holloway didn't ask many questions when Kevin placed the full report on his desk. The documentation was organized, complete, supported by verified statements and clear timelines. Grant read through it in silence, his expression tightening slightly as the pieces aligned in a different direction than before. "This changes things," Grant said. Kevin nodded once. "It should." The response came quickly after that. Brooke Archer was taken into custody at the house later that week, in the middle of a quiet morning that didn't match the weight of what was happening. There were no raised voices, no dramatic resistance, just a controlled removal, hands secured, eyes forward. She looked at Kevin once as she was let out. There was no performance left in her face, no adjustment, no control. Just a brief moment of something unguarded, something he had never seen before, and then it was gone. Kevin didn't respond. He didn't step forward. He didn't follow. He stayed exactly where he was. Alyssa Archer found out that same day. 17, old enough to understand the words, not old enough to process what they meant without it breaking something fundamental. She didn't ask Kevin for explanations right away. She didn't argue. She withdrew quietly, the way people do when trust collapses faster than they can rebuild it. Kevin gave her space. He didn't try to fix it. Some things weren't meant to be repaired immediately. The house felt different after that. Not empty, not quiet, just clear. Kevin moved through it without hesitation, without attachment, seeing it for what it was now, not a life he had built, but a structure he had been placed inside, without ever fully understanding who had designed it. He packed what mattered, left what didn't. And when he walked out, he didn't look back, because for the first time, there was nothing behind him that needed to be understood. Only something ahead that needed to be chosen more carefully. Kevin had spent years believing that survival meant enduring whatever was placed in front of him, adapting, accepting, moving forward without questioning the foundation beneath him. But what he learned, what it cost him to learn, was that patience without awareness becomes permission, and trust without attention becomes vulnerability. He didn't lose everything. He lost the illusion that everything was real, and that in the end was the only thing that made sure it would never happen to him again.